Who are some of the chief deist deities?
Bearing in mind that it is not always possible to draw neat distinctions between deist divinities and those of CCT. Here are some of the figures that appear to have at least originated in deist circles. They are called the earlier heaven deities. At the top of the pantheon are the three pure ones, Sansheng. They seem to have been Daoism's theological rejoinder to the Buddhist groupings in which bodhisattvas flank Amitabha Buddha to form a celestial triad. The three pure ones, or sacred beings, are named after the heavens in which they dwell. The heavens of the jade, higher, and great purity, respectively. This triad evidently developed out of a trio of deified human beings of history or legend. Lao Zi, known as Tianshang Laojun, Lord of the Daoist teaching, was the first so elevated. Later a deity called Heavenly Venerable of the original beginning, Yuan Shi Tianzun, was named as chief deity. And still later a third deity, Grand Lord of the Dao, Taishang Dao Jun, leapfrogged the two others to the top of the triad. These three, often depicted as enthroned elders, came to be identified with the more transcendent and abstract pure ones. Many consider the deified Lao Zi still a separate deity who ranks above the three pure ones. The Jade Emperor, Yu Huangdadi, was eventually identified either as the chief deity's younger brother or as an incarnation of the Lord of the Heaven of Great Purity, and became the prominent deity in some CCT cults. According to one theological model, the three pure ones are manifestations of the primordial cosmic energy, Qi.
How do Muslims view Islam's relationship to other traditions?
According to the Quran, the revelation delivered through Muhammad is not new, but a continuation and reaffirmation of the divine message given to all. The earlier prophets acknowledged in the Jewish and Christian traditions. If prior generations of Jews and Christians had not misinterpreted or even willfully corrupted the message, subsequent corrective revelations would have been unnecessary. In other words, Muslims regard Islam's relationship to the earlier Abrahamic faith somewhat the way Christians regard their tradition's relationship to Judaism. The later revelation completes, fulfills, corrects, or abrogates the earlier one. Islamic tradition regards the peoples of the book as especially close kin. The Quran suggests that Muslims should consider Christians perhaps somewhat closer than Jews. Even though there are far larger theological differences between Islam and Christianity than between Islam and Judaism. The concept of peoples of the book also came to include other minority religious communities of the Middle East, such as the Zoroastrians. In general, Muslims are inclined to regard members of other traditions, such as Hindus and Buddhists, for example, as considerably further removed from the possibility of salvation. but views of that sort naturally vary somewhat from region to region. As for example, in India, where Muslims and Hindus often live side by side.
Have there been any Shinto mystics?
Mainstream Shinto tradition has not been particularly noted for producing important mystical figures. That is not to say that there have been no Shinto mystics. But talk of mystical union with the divine has come more from various syncretistic schools and sects, especially those heavily influenced by non-Japanese schools of religious thought. Kurozumai Muntada, founder of the Kurozumai sect with a distinctively Neo-Confucian tilt, taught the importance of the deliberate quest to become a kami. He himself is said to have experienced oneness with the sun goddess Amaterasu when she suffused his body.
How do the sage, correlate, worthy one, scholar, and superior person differ?
The first four are all stages or levels in the Confucian hierarchy of human striving and perfectibility. They are the ranks of extraordinary individuals judged suitable for inclusion in the Confucian temple's various memorial halls. All four are, by definition, superior persons. At the pinnacle of the pyramid stands the sage, the Confucian analogy to the saint. Confucian tradition devised the various other terms, such as worthy one and correlate to describe the historical and spiritual proximity of famous scholars and sages to Confucius himself. In most Confucian temples the ranks or levels in the tradition's memorial hierarchy are indicated by the relative placement of name tablets. Those closest to the master's tablet rank highest, and are generally called sages or correlates. Those in the rooms along the side of the temple compound are the far more numerous worthies and scholars. Scholars of sufficient prestige to have their names in the temple qualify as superior persons. But that designation is not used in the memorial rankings.
Do Buddhists celebrate feast days of any other important religious figures?
In China, Japan, and Tibet especially, Buddhists hold feasts in honor of various bodhisattvas and holy persons. The death anniversary of Bodhidharma, traditionally believed to be the founding patriarch of Chinese Zen, occurs on the 5th day of the 10th lunar month, Bhadrapada, August/September. Events in the life of Tibetan Buddhism's important patriarch Padmasambhava provide a kind of narrative. Sacred structure for the entire year with special observances occurring on the 10th day of each lunar month. Devotees celebrate his flight from the world in the first month, his taking of religious vows in the second, and his miraculous transformation of fire into water during the third, for example. One of the most widely celebrated sacred persons is the Bodhisattva Guanyin, called Kannon in Japan. Her special day is the 19th of a given lunar month, with her birthday occurring during the second month. Her enlightenment during the 6th, and her entry into nirvana during the 9th.
What is the principal Confucian virtue?
Behind all the other virtues, what makes a good Confucian tick is filial devotion or xiao. The Chinese term is composed of sun with old placed above it. Confucius taught that all other moral virtue, and indeed civilization itself, flows from filial devotion. As a bare minimum, one should do no harm to one's parents. Filial devotion culminates in doing one's family proud. Traditional texts go into great detail about how one ought to treat parents. Summarizing ideal behavior in 5 duties: reverence always, joyful service, solicitude for ailing parents, sincere grief at a parent's death, and proper ritual veneration thereafter. Lack of filial devotion was a most serious offense. Individuals could be put to death for cursing their elders. Filial devotion was the very bedrock of social order, a fundamental acknowledgement of authority on the family level, without which there could be no exercise of authority in society at large. Chinese tradition regards society as built on the family. Sons and daughters do not go out into the world as they reach maturity. Rather than leaving the nest, they invest themselves in the family, knowing that their children will do the same. Only in that way can the foundations of society as a whole remain firm.
Have prophets and prophecy figured prominently in Christian tradition?
Christianity grew at least initially out of Jewish tradition, in which the prophets of the Old Testament played a central role. A prophetess named Anna was in the temple when Mary and Joseph presented their child there to fulfill the law, and proclaimed Jesus the salvation of Jerusalem, Luke 2:36-38. Jesus himself was very much a part of that prophetic heritage. He and his contemporaries wondered about the spiritual identity of Jesus' cousin John, the Baptist. Many consider John a prophet, Mark 11:32, and Jesus told his followers that John was indeed a prophet. But even more, he was the very Elijah whose return had been foretold, Matthew 11:11-15. The Gospels report that many identified Jesus, too, as the expected prophet, and that Jesus even hinted that they were correct, c.e.g. Matthew 10:41, 13:57, 21:11. Pauline letters list prophets as belonging to a rank or office second only to that of apostle, suggesting that prophecy continued to play an important role after Jesus' death, e.g. Corinthians 12:28, Ephesians 4:11. It is not clear in those cases how these prophets functioned. Long after the age of biblical prophecy, some Christians have identified modern saints as prophets who have raised their voices in opposition to oppression and injustice. Such courageous people are, therefore, spokespersons for God in our time, thus fulfilling the role of prophets of old. Many are tempted to regard prophecy as a synonym for foretelling the future. But that has never been the primary role of prophets.
How do monasteries function in Buddhist life?
During the early centuries of Buddhism, monks and nuns lived as itinerant beggars with no fixed abode. The practice of staying put during the monsoon season gave rise to permanent monastic institutions. Monks and nuns lived either in viharas, separate structures, or dwellings carved like caves into hillsides, guhas. Many early monasteries functioned somewhat like parishes, offering spiritual services to the local population. These smaller, more pastorally oriented monasteries were eventually replaced by larger monastic complexes with a focus on learning. Many monasteries, especially in Theravada lands, still offer educational services to the people of the area. In general, Theravada monasteries throughout Southeast Asia maintain somewhat more active links with the outside community than do Mahayana monasteries. Japanese Zen monasteries, for example, still focus on a life of seclusion and solitude. Tibetan institutions have until recently been the virtual backbone of community life on the roof of the world and were home to an extraordinarily large percentage of the male population. Some monasteries are now part of what one might call consortiums, with as many as 24 individual temple monasteries of the same denomination clustered within one larger institution. Most classic monasteries are walled enclosures divided into private and public areas. Monks' residences and private ritual spaces are separated from the ritual and educational facilities that serve visitors.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Confucian and Cit worship?
When Confucius was young, he was particularly intrigued by the classic bronze vessels his ancestors had used for centuries in honoring heaven. Most of these vessels held materials to be offered. The principal forms developed in connection with the particular types of material. A vase, was to hold sacrificial wine, a jug, zwi, poured libations. And beaker, gu, may have been used for sharing a communion-like drink. The ding was a bowl for ritual foods such as cereal grains or fruit. Some of these objects apparently were designed in particularly symbolic shapes, such as the hill-shaped censer, whose form recalled the 5 sacred mountains. Some bronzes bear abstract representations of the 4 directional creatures: the black tortoise of the wintry north, the green dragon of the vernal east, the scarlet bird of the summery south, and the white tiger of the autumnal west. Inscriptions dedicating an object to a father. For example, or expressing the hope that sons and grandsons will use the vessel for 10,000 years. Suggest that they were commonly used in ancestor veneration rituals. Even today, copies of those antique objects adorn the altars in Confucian temples and are part of the relatively infrequent offerings held there. Many of the sacred vessels were buried in tombs or even thrown into river beds during invasions to prevent them from falling into the hands of barbarians. Nearly every large museum has good examples in its Asian collections, and they are well worth a visit.
Are there any other important Daoist sacred figures?
One important subordinate deity is Xian Tian Shangdi, Supreme Emperor of Dark Heaven. The Jade Emperor dispatched him to Earth to battle a band of renegade demon kings. His iconography shows him enthroned and using a serpent and a turtle, leaders of the demons, as a footstool. A legendary woman named Shi Wangmu, also known as the Queen Mother of the West, figures prominently in some Daoist writings. She is a patroness of immortality, often depicted in the company of jade maidens, one carrying a fan and the other a bushel of the peaches of longevity. Ruling the east is her divine consort, Dung Wanggong, who lives in the remote magical fastness of the Kunlun Mountains. In a reversal of the more usual dynamic, a god of walls and moats, also known as the city god, began as a popular deity and made his way into the Daoist pantheon. During certain periods in history, the heavenly master appointed a given city's tutelary deity. City god has the assistance of several other figures, called spirit secretaries, in the idiom of public administration. They help the city god deliver his reports on the conduct of citizens to the authorities in hell. A goddess named Do-Mu, mother of the bushel of stars, or northern dipper, functions in Daoism much the way Guanyin does in Buddhism, offering limitless compassion for the suffering. Some other potent beings are clustered in groups. The Sennin are a group of sacred figures who dwell in heaven or in the distant misty mountains. Among the Sennin, the most important are the 8 immortals. Originally persons either historical, 3, or legendary. 5, they function as guardian figures of Daoism. Although they are not officially divine, popular lore sometimes attributes divine powers to them. They are called later heaven deities, as are all human figures who eventually achieved immortality.
How important was the School of National Learning?
National learning, or Kokyugaku, had perhaps more to do with the modern understanding of Shinto than has any other movement within the tradition. Katen no Azumamaro, 1669–1736, is generally considered the founder of the school, insisting on the need to return to the earliest genuinely and purely Japanese sources. Among those he included the Kyojiki, but emphasized the Kojiki and Nihongi especially. Kumo no Mabuchi, 1697–1769. Continued what Kata had begun by applying philological methods to classical Japanese prayer and poetry. He considered spontaneity the native Japanese gift, without which nothing could be truly Japanese. Motori Norinaga, 1730–1801, continued the scholarly dynasty, and is still regarded by some as Shinto's best theological mind. His 44-volume commentary on the Kojiki remains a monument of scholarship. Hirata Itsutane, 1763–1843, was the latest and perhaps most influential exponent of the school, in that he implemented the thought of his predecessor Motori. Together these four men were largely responsible for the articulation of modern Shinto's highly nationalistic and ethnocentric tone.
How do Christians view Christianity's relationship to other traditions?
Three major issues are especially important here. First is the notion that Christianity completes, supersedes, or abrogates Judaism. Ancient messianic expectation found its mark in Jesus, Christians believe, thereby rendering Judaism historically irrelevant. Second, Christians believe that in Jesus God has granted the final and definitive revelation. Any post-Christian claims to prophetic authority are therefore unacceptable and not to be believed. Islam is the most obvious example of a claim to prophetic revelation after Jesus. So it is not surprising that the history of Christian-Muslim relations has often been stormy. Third, personal assent to the divine revelation embodied in Jesus is essential to salvation, so that only those who so believe can hope to be rewarded in the hereafter. For many Christians, it simply does not matter that most human beings through the course of history have never heard of Jesus. In this instance, many Christians have in mind not only the 80% of humanity that are not Christian, but even some of their fellow Christians whose beliefs they consider flawed or incomplete. Such exclusive views are hardly unique to Christianity, but many Christian groups recently have begun to respond to the reality of the world as it is, with all its religious wealth, by understanding that very diversity as an essential ingredient in the divine plan. From this perspective, it is no longer possible to assert simply and categorically that one segment of humanity is assured of salvation while another segment is lost virtually by an accident of birth.
What is Neo-Daoism?
Neo-Daoism is a name commonly given to various developments around the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. Some scholars suggest that there were two recognizable schools. One was called secret mystical teaching, Xian Shui. According to some interpreters, an important theme was its emphasis on the quest for physical immortality. Earlier deist sources had spoken of immortality, but generally of the spiritual rather than the bodily sort. Neo-Daoism recommended exercises in breathing, diet, use of potions, elixirs, and talismans, and sexual activity reminiscent of Hindu and Buddhist tantric practices. But perhaps more fundamental in this alchemy were intense meditative practices intended to reveal the Dao within the individual. Some scholars interpret Qian Shui as developing out of Confucian rather than Daoist thought. A major feature of the second school, known as pure conversation, Qingtian, is its attempts to blend aspects of Daoist, Confucian, and Buddhist thought. Among its proponents were the so-called seven sages of the bamboo grove, whose penchant for detached philosophical discourse and the cultivation of a Daoist aesthetic were among their hallmarks. On the basis of their reading of the Zhuangzi and Dao De Jing, they developed a neo-Daoist interpretation of the so-called Confucian classics. After the 5th century, Buddhist concepts infiltrated the movement to such a degree that neo-Daoism gradually lost its distinctiveness and identity.
Is there an Islamic fundamentalism?
Unfortunately, the term fundamentalist has become virtually synonymous with Muslim in contemporary American usage. This is unfortunate because, when applied to Muslims, fundamentalist has been simultaneously linked to terrorism. It is fair to say that most devout Muslims interpret their scriptures conservatively and quite literally, as do the vast majority of devout adherents to many traditions. Islamic fundamentalism is not inherently more likely to be expressed in extreme behavior than any other brand of fundamentalism. One can of course point to examples of such behavior in virtually every tradition, including the assassination of abortion providers by American Christians and the burning of Christian villagers by angry Hindu mobs in India. Extreme and violent behavior that claims religious justification invariably has a great deal to do with predominant political and social climates in particular places and times. Non-Muslims often apply the epithet fundamentalist indiscriminately to widely diverse situations. For example, so-called militant fundamentalists in Algeria attempt to justify their activism on very different grounds than do, say, Shiite factions in southern Lebanon. The Palestinian organization called Hamas, and the revolutionary government of Iran. In other words, while the term fundamentalism has value in describing some religious phenomena, it has become so imprecise as to be virtually useless as a way of describing Muslims.
What are some of the main varieties of Islamic religious officials or specialists?
Islamic religious specialists are a large general class of people called ulama, meaning those who possess knowledge, ilm. An alim, pronounced aalim, commonly used singular of ulama, pronounced oulamaah. Is an individual who has done extensive study of the Quran, tafsir, exegetical commentary, and hadith, for starters. Some become specialists in Quran recitation. One who memorizes the entire text and learns to recite it in an elaborate and demanding style called tajwid. Pronounced tajweed, embellished. Excellent, is called a qari, pronounced kaahri, professional Quran reciter. Some religious scholars further specialize in religious jurisprudence, fiqh, understanding. Such a scholar is called a faqih, pronounced faqih, one who understands deeply. Because he applies his intellect to plumb the depths of the fundamental religious sources in an effort to apply their principles to daily life. Some religious scholars routinely engage in the categorization of various acts according to their relative legal and moral acceptability. In that capacity the scholar is called a mufti, pronounced mufti. One who issues a legal advisory called a fatwa, pronounced fatwa. Specialists in the religious sciences often carry the honorific title of sheikh. Elder, a term that was reserved for tribal leaders during pre-Islamic times. Spiritual guides of the various Sufi organizations called orders or paths, tariqa, pronounced ta'ariqa. Also generally bear the title of sheikh or its Persian equivalent, pir, pronounced pir.
What is a sacred text or scripture?
All of the traditions surveyed in this book possess extensive sacred literatures. These sacred texts are commonly called scriptures, literally, writings. Some traditions revolve around a single scripture, a book composed over a relatively short period of time and perhaps associated with only a single human figure. Islam's Quran is such a text. Others have generated their sacred writings in stages lasting many centuries, resulting in scriptures that are more like anthologies of smaller books bound together in a single larger volume. The Hebrew Scriptures, what many Christians call the Old Testament, are an example. Still other traditions revolve around the equivalent of whole libraries of sacred texts that came into being over as much as 2 millennia, as in the case of the greater Hinduism's vast patrimony. In addition to the primary sacred texts, many traditions have large collections of secondary texts, still considered essential but of slightly lesser authority. Islam has its sayings of Muhammad, hadith, for example. In addition, the primary and secondary scriptures themselves often give rise to still further development of highly authoritative literature that takes the form of commentary on the scriptures. Rabbinical Judaism is enshrined in hundreds of volumes of this kind.
Is there such a thing as converting into Shinto?
Since Shinto is so intimately identified with being Japanese, the concept of conversion is largely irrelevant. That does not mean that no non-Japanese has ever deliberately chosen to become a practitioner of Shinto. But such instances are very rare. The case of Judaism offers a rough parallel. Many consider membership in Judaism a matter of ethnicity. But some Jewish congregations nevertheless welcome converts into their community. Some have developed formal initiatory rites for ethnically non-Jewish individuals. But Shinto tradition does not have such a rite for non-Japanese who wish to practice and profess Shinto tradition. The difference here is that membership in Judaism presupposes assent to certain basic creedal affirmations, whereas Shinto does not.
Are music and dance important in religious ritual?
Sacred dance is one of the oldest forms of religious ritual known. Many liturgical traditions have developed out of classical religious dance, which often arose in turn as a medium in which to reenact central mythic narratives. Dance can assume various forms, from performance by ritual specialists alone, to visual display by a highly trained and richly decked out troupe, to whole congregations performing relatively simple repetitive movements. This is where the use of ritual costumes sometimes extends beyond the clergy or central ritual specialists. Some traditions, such as Shinto and other indigenous communities of faith, use dance at various levels of sacrality. Special rites might occur at or near the holiest part of a place of worship, while dance of a more entertaining and less esoteric sort might be available on separate small stages elsewhere on the grounds. Most sacred are reenactments of central mythic stories. More popular performances often teach some moral point humorously. Musical accompaniment to religious ritual takes many forms and is generally more widespread than dance. Religious traditions run the gamut, from those that use no instrumental or vocal music at all to those whose rituals are almost entirely musical. Some traditions favor very arcane music, played on ancient instruments, to establish a mood of solemnity by creating the kind of sounds one would hear only in a particular ritual setting. This kind of music can be difficult to listen to, but its purpose is to mark the occasion as genuinely out of the ordinary. Others use music designed to encourage maximum participation rather than to establish distance. The latter typically develop extensive hymnographies.
What does the term revelation mean in Islamic tradition?
Islam's scripture, the Quran, consistently refers to itself as the word that God has sent down. Tanzil, pronounced Tanzeel, to humankind through Muhammad. That which is sent down represents a manifestation of truths that have existed from all eternity in the heavenly archetype of the Quran known as the mother of the book. God reveals by communicating in a language understandable to the intended audience. Both the Quran and subsequent Muslim tradition describe the actual process of revelation by a technical term, wahy, that distinguishes prophetic revelation from the kinds of inspiration that animate holy persons and artists, for example. The prophetic intermediary hears the message not with physical ears but with the ears of the spirit and heart. Some descriptions of revelation suggest a visionary dimension as well, as when the angel Gabriel or another mysterious unnamed presence appears. According to both Quran and Hadith, Muhammad received revelations in a wide variety of circumstances. In some cases revelation is given in response to a particular question asked of the Prophet. In others, Muhammad is described as praying, preaching, eating, or even bathing. Muhammad is said to have experienced a variety of actual sensations when he received a revelation. He spoke of a sound like bees humming around his face, or a loud bell, the sound of which was physically painful. Sometimes he broke into a cold sweat or showed signs like those of a trance or seizure. All of the prophets are said to have experienced similar forms of revelation. What is most significant here is Muhammad's overwhelming sense of the divine presence at these moments.
What is a martyr?
The word martyr comes from a Greek word that means witness. Some traditions have made a special place for believers so committed to their faith that they have been willing to die, either in the active spread and defense of the faith or as a way of protesting forced conversion or apostasy. Most people will likely associate martyrdom with Christianity and Islam, but there are numerous examples of unconditional witnessing of religious beliefs and values from a host of traditions. Some examples involve self-immolation or voluntary starvation. Many great religious leaders have engaged in fasting as protest even to death, whether they die in battle or in protest. All martyrs give witness to values they believe are more important than life itself.
Are there any signs or symbols that might identify an individual as a practitioner of Shinto?
Apart from times of participation in public or private rituals, it is virtually impossible to identify practitioners of Shinto on the basis of appearances. When people join in festival processions, many don small jackets called happy that extend to about mid-thigh, and headbands. Happy sometimes bear the logo of the local association that carries the Mikoshi portable shrine in processions. On special days, young women may dress up in their best kimono. Devotees sometimes return home from shrines carrying amulets or talismans, but these items are visible less often on the person than in the home.
How did Gautama become the Buddha?
At the age of 29, tradition says, Gautama made the great renunciation of comfort and security. Borne aloft by his horse, he went over the palace walls to pursue a realistic understanding of the world and the human condition. Gautama went first to learn from two Hindu teachers, spiritual guides like those who tutor seekers in the Hindu scriptures called the Upanishads. Unsatisfied with that more philosophical approach, Gautama joined a group of ascetics in Benares. Representatives of the Jain movement perhaps, and subjected himself to several years of dire austerity. When that, too, failed, he moved on and decided to meditate alone under a tree until he achieved enlightenment. During the course of 7 weeks there, Siddhartha went through 4 trance-like stages, arriving finally at the stark realization of what Buddhist tradition calls the most basic truths of human life. Siddhartha was now worthy of the name Buddha, the enlightened one. But tradition suggests that the Buddha experienced a terrible interior struggle with the temptation to keep his newfound wisdom to himself. Mara, the demon, summoned up all his might to prevent the truths of enlightenment from spreading abroad. Overcoming all inclination to selfishness, the 35-year-old Buddha dedicated himself to teaching others the way to freedom from attachment that is the cause of all suffering. He returned to Benares, reunited with the 5 ascetics with whom he had parted company earlier, and preached the sermon called Turning the Wheel of the Law. Now the Buddha was indeed a wheel turner, but not as his father had envisioned. For the next 45 years, he would turn the greatest of all wheels, that of the Dharma. He died in Kushinagara at the age of 80, in about 463 BCE, of apparent food poisoning. Buddha on the big screen, some favorite motion pictures. Green Snake, 1993. A combination of mysticism and action based on a Chinese fable. Green Snake, Maggie Cheung, and Sun Qing, Joey Wang, are actual reptiles who have been practicing taking human form. When self-righteous Buddhist monk Fa Hai discovers them, he thinks it's a sin to tamper with the natural order. Cantonese with English subtitles. Kundan. 1997, in 1937, in a remote area of Tibet close to the Chinese border, a 2-year-old child is identified as the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the compassionate Buddha. He is brought to Lhasa to be schooled as a monk and as head of state. The film follows him into adulthood until his flight to India after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Little Buddha. 1993, Tibetan Lama Norbu informs the Conrad family of Seattle that their 10-year-old son Jesse may be the reincarnation of a respected monk. Stars Keanu Reeves? 7 years in Tibet. 1997, Heinrich Harrer, Brad Pitt, travels to the Himalayas on a mountain climbing trip. War breaks out and he is placed in a prisoner of war camp. He escapes to Tibet where he befriends the young Dalai Lama and witnesses the escalation of the conflict between Tibet and China. Temptation of a monk. 1994, costume drama about China's 7th century Tang dynasty. General Shi, Wu Xianguo, is duped into an assassination plot against the crown prince. After a massacre, the general flees and finds sanctuary with a group of Buddhist monks at a remote temple. Why has Bodhidharma left for the East? 1989. Set in a remote monastery in the Korean mountains, the film follows an old master, close to death, who must lead his disciples in their search for spiritual freedom. Korean with English subtitles.
Is there such a thing as a saint in Confucianism?
Confucius revered the ancient kings as sages, Sheng. Figures of towering intellect and virtue who represented an ideal never again to be attained by mere mortals. Their inimitability prevented the ancients from functioning as exemplars and restricted them to the role of venerable ancestors to whom all owed a debt of gratitude. Meng Zhi began to modify the role of the sage. He suggested that the sage appears in every age, not only in the distant past. And he emphasized the sage's humanity and imitability. Individuals could aspire to and cultivate the qualities of the sage through education. With the Song dynasty came Neo-Confucianism and a further expansion of the sage's role. Building on the classic text called the Great Learning, De Shui, medieval scholars spoke of a series of stages through which an aspirant could advance toward the lofty goal of sagehood. Neo-Confucians identified the sage as the individual who had fully actualized all moral and intellectual potential and arrived at a state of oneness with the universe. Like the Daoist sage, as described in the Dao De Jing, the Confucian sage embodies perfect harmony with the cosmos. Unlike the Daoist sage, the Confucian puts wisdom's insights to work by active involvement in the ordinary affairs of society. A Confucian sage is like the Buddhist bodhisattva in that both are committed to the betterment of the human condition. The 10-stage bodhisattva career offers a general parallel to the Neo-Confucian system of steps toward sagehood. But whereas the bodhisattva has the power to reach down and change the plight of those who ask for help, the sage offers the hope of transformation through determination and effort. Sages model the best in Confucianism's spirituality of public service.
Were any other related schools of thought important in understanding Confucianism?
Mozi, 468 to 390 BCE, started out as a Confucian but went his own way, opting for a less stratified, more egalitarian model of society. Some have characterized Mozi as a pragmatist because he insisted that observable improvement in the welfare of the populace was the ultimate criterion of good public policy. Confucius, he argued, put too much emphasis on ritual and filial devotion and too little on measurably advancing civilization. Mozi taught the importance of striving for a society united by a kind of mutual love that amounted to a form of enlightened self-interest. His school flourished for just over a century. But it offers a glimpse at one of several credible critiques of the classical Confucian approach. Another dissenting voice of Mozi's era were the legalists, Fajia. They took Mozi's critique several steps further from Confucius' global confidence that the mere example of virtuous leadership could bring about a moral conversion in society. Governance, they argued, required clear and comprehensive legislation that capitalized on people's fear of punishment and hope of reward. Confucius and Mozi clearly had greater faith in human perfectibility and in a reservoir of goodwill at the heart of humankind.
How do Buddhists deal ritually with death and mourning?
Practice varies according to denomination and cultural setting, but there are a number of common elements. These include prayer at the deathbed and preparation of the body, a wake that includes final viewing. Funeral service typically in a mortuary or funeral home, interment. Usually of cremated remains but with full burial in some circumstances, and a series of memorial services at intervals. Beginning immediately after death and then in anniversary years calculated in various different ways. Viewing the body at the wake is a powerful reminder of the universal fact of impermanence. Funeral ceremonies center on recitation or chanting of appropriate sacred texts chosen to help mourners to see the event in the context of the full sweep of human existence. An officiating priest, monk, or minister may offer a eulogy, and participants make offerings of incense. In some places, like Japan, families inter the cremated remains either in a columbarium connected to a temple or in a cemetery on temple grounds. Memorial services are important in virtually all Buddhist denominations, especially when Buddhism interacts with ancient traditions of ancestor veneration. Many Mahayana Buddhists observe memorials 7, 35, 49 and 100 days after death, and after 1, 3, 7, 13, 17, 33, 50 and 100 years. Some consider the 49th day especially important, since at that point the soul ceases its wandering. Theravada practice often includes memorial services 2 days after death at the home, 2 or 3 days after that at the funeral establishment, and again 7 days after interment. The object of the last ceremony is to transfer merit from the living to the dead to ensure a good rebirth. Many Buddhists also offer a meal in the home or elsewhere for mourners after funeral services or interment.
What attitudes toward pilgrimage are important in Confucianism and CIT?
Confucian teaching generally did not promote the popular practice of pilgrimage, associated as it was with Daoism and Buddhism. A larger concern had to do with the social and political implications of devotional travel. Many Confucians considered pilgrimage a potential threat to the stability of society. Anthropologists talk about the experience of liminality as an essential part of pilgrimage. Pilgrims step out of their accustomed social roles, leaving behind the rules, duties, and responsibilities of ordinary daily life. They become liminal in that they step across a threshold, limen in Latin, into another way of being and thinking, if only temporarily. For people who regard their function as maintaining social order, the prospect of throngs of pilgrims heading out across the countryside in hope of miracles or magic naturally poses a threat. Enthusiastic crowds are prey to demagogues and can turn into unruly mobs. Still, a parallel to devotional pilgrimage developed among Confucians on a smaller scale. Confucius himself became a model of the itinerant scholar, traveling from one province to another in search of disciples and patrons. Later Confucians often followed his example. Eventually the places in which these Confucian exemplars had lived and taught began to attract visitors. Not surprisingly, the tomb of Confucius in Shandong became a goal for Confucian pilgrims, who were generally in search not of miracles, but of inspiration in the struggle to live a good life. In general, it appears that the tradition of family members caring for ancestral graves may have been significant in preventing burial places from becoming pilgrimage goals. Mountains were also important destinations for China's literati. There, one could contemplate most abundantly nature's sacred beauty. There, too, was the incomparable source of poetic inspiration.
Are there any contemporary remnants of CIT?
Nearly a century has passed since the last emperor stepped down from the dragon throne. And CIT as an institution is little more than a fading memory. For many Chinese, CIT remains a historical curiosity. A large tourism industry has grown up around the preservation of major monuments such as the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven in Beijing. Chinese tourists flock to these great repositories of their ancient heritage. Mao Zedong and his political heirs considered the remnants of feudal and imperial society as reminders of a thoroughly discredited way of life. They are mere museum pieces to many, and relics of an oppressive past to others. But they remain important evidence in reconstructing the story of Chinese religion.
What does the term Matsuri mean?
Matsuri is the inclusive word for virtually all Shinto-inspired communal celebrations. The term derives from a root that can mean to deify or enshrine. These festivities generally celebrate manifestations of the kami who have a special relationship to a region or town. Though some celebrate kami of more widespread significance as well. They acknowledge the inseparable link among the kami, the land, and the community of people living there. since it emphasizes the seamless interrelationships among these three elements. Shinto tradition makes no distinction between sacred and profane time. All of creation, time, and space, is sacred. Matsuri mark those times and places that are more than ordinarily sacred. Just when divine energy appears on the wane, a Matsuri occurs and renews that spiritual potency. Festivities periodically restore the ancient cosmic order of nature. Japanese often celebrate Matsuri with an enormous vigor, and almost uncontrolled energy. Bands of young men undertake strenuous feats of lifting and hauling enormous loads, competing with other groups to deliver their sacred burdens to the shrine or another ritual destination. That feeling of wild unpredictability offers an important insight into the Shinto sense of the divine as both benevolent and dangerous. Some Matsuri are explicitly identified as non-religious civic events. But even today the majority are of religious origin and reflect classical Shinto or folk beliefs, or both. Most also retain their ancient associations with seasonal and agricultural concerns. Matsuri typically include both processions and activities within a shrine compound. Special offerings and prayers, plays and dancing and other entertainments. And communal meals are features of all the great festivities.
Are dreams and visions important in Hindu tradition?
Dreams and visions are often described as the means by which particularly holy individuals receive special knowledge or responsibilities. Spiritually advanced members of different denominations describe experiences in which their particular chosen deity appears and manifests his or her divine form. The deity's desires for the founding of a temple in a particular place are often communicated in dreams or visions. Traditional Hindu psychology considers dreaming one of the four ordinary states of consciousness. Founders of various denominations and sects often report dreams or visions as the impetus for a personal conversion or for proclaiming a new teaching.
How do Shinto practitioners celebrate birth?
Not long after a couple have a baby, traditionally about 30 days, they take the child to the shrine for a natal blessing. This is consistent with the belief that all new ventures and beginnings will fare better if brought before the kami. In addition, the symbolism includes the belief that the infant thus becomes a child of the family's protector kami. Parents arrange with shrine staff for a standard ceremony that takes place inside the haiden, or outer worship hall. At larger shrines, a senior priest, assistant priest, and miko typically perform the ceremony, pronouncing solemn prayers in an archaic Japanese. The priests then perform blessings over the young family by waving the harigushi. The miko may also participate by blessing the worshippers with a green sakeke branch. Ancient Shinto tradition retains a class of divine beings called kami of birth or beginnings, Musubi no kami. They include kami of fire, youth, plenty, and the creator divinities who brought all things to birth.
What is the philosophy of religion?
Some philosophers make a specialty of inquiring into the reasonableness of religious belief systems. As far back as Thomas Aquinas, d. 1274, in Europe, Ghazali, d. 1111, and Ibn Rushd, d. 1198, among medieval Muslims, the Hindu Shankara, d. 820, and even back to the Buddhist Nagarjuna, c. 150 to 250, and earlier, religious thinkers have tackled questions of how much truth reason can grasp. Thomas Aquinas' classic 5 proofs for the existence of God are among the most famous inquiries of this type. Philosophers of religion provide a great service in their attempts to keep religious language and truth claims honest, along with philosophical attempts to give a rational justification for religious beliefs, a subspecialty in the philosophy of religion deals with the intricate analysis of various forms of religious expression. It analyzes religious language, ritual, and statements of belief as to their rationality. Virtually every major religious tradition, at some periods during its history, has developed alongside of philosophical schools that have acted as gadflies or devil's advocates.
How do Christians mark formal entry into their various faith communities?
Along with the Lord's Supper, baptism is one of the 2 rituals the vast majority of Christians recognize as a sacrament. Its symbolism recalls the cleansing waters of the flood and the crossing of the Red Sea and Jordan. Essential elements in baptism are flowing water and the formula "I baptize you," or "the servant of God is baptized, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." Infant baptism was the norm until the Reformation. Catholic, Orthodox, Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, and Congregational churches still baptize infants, while some churches defer the ritual until the candidate is a teenager or older. Baptism can be administered by total or partial immersion, with the candidate descending into a pool or with the officiant lowering the infant into a font, or by effusion, in which the officiant pours water over the candidate's head only.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Muslim worship and prayer?
By far the most important ritual object is the Quran. Since Muslims regard the sacred book as the very word of God, they try to treat the physical object with the greatest respect. Some mosques own ancient and beautifully wrought Qurans, often in multiple volumes, that are used only for special occasions. The more ancient the mosque, the more likely it will also have specially crafted podiums on which to place the Quran, and possibly also storage containers. Both stand and box often feature carefully chosen inscriptions from the Quran and Hadith that remind devotees of the divine origin and power of the sacred word. One of the most important among the relatively few other items that have been a regular part of Muslim devotions is the classic prayer rug, displaying a central shape that recalls the mihrab on the Mecca ward wall of the mosque. High-quality prayer rugs often use geometric and floral design inspired by the Quran's verse of light. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. His light is like a niche in which is a lamp within a glass, like a shining star kindled from a sacred olive tree, neither of east nor west, whose oil would nearly glow even if no fire touched it. Quran 24:35. Inspired by the same verse, beautifully enameled glass lamps were once raised to a fine art and hung by the dozens in the great mosques of the Middle East. The shimmering light cast through their multicolored Quranic inscriptions and arabesque designs would have been similar to that cast through Europe's stained glass windows.
What do Hindus believe about ultimate spiritual reality or God?
Hindu conceptions about God are among the most expansive and arresting in the history of religion. Scores of names and forms make up the enormous Hindu theological lexicon. Some names and forms emphasize divine majesty and power, others divine beauty and attractiveness. For Hindus generally, the purpose of religious belief and devotion is to cultivate a relationship with the holy, the source of benevolence and blessing as well as of death and difficulty. Most of all, God is a mystery that is willing to be unveiled. Hindu theologians define two broad ways of talking about the God. Ultimate reality, called Brahman in Sanskrit. God is beyond all imagining and impossible to shoehorn into humanly devised words and concepts. But believers can still refer to the ultimate reality in a roundabout way, hinting at what God is by saying explicitly what God is not. From this perspective, theologians call the God Brahman without qualities, Nirguna Brahman. But the negative way of thinking about God can be very abstract and difficult. Human beings generally need something more concrete, something that engages the feelings and imagination as well as the logic-bound mind. Hindu tradition therefore acknowledges that one can approach the truth by considering God as Brahman with qualities, Guna Brahman. In this approach, one has always to keep in mind that those qualities are remote approximations at best, and ultimately just a concession to the human need to imagine the unimaginable.
What is a Messiah?
Mashiach is a Hebrew word that means anointed one, Christos is the Greek equivalent. Anointing is an ancient Jewish ritual first used to consecrate the priesthood and later to elevate Saul and David to kingly office. Expectation of the coming of a Messiah arose in Jewish tradition, especially during and after the Babylonian exile. Bereft of both temple and monarchy, Jews longed for a restoration of their former estate under the guidance of a descendant of David. For the next several centuries, various notions developed as to how one would recognize the Messiah when he appeared, but tradition did not arrive at a consensus. The Essene community evidently looked forward to two messiahs, one with spiritual and the other with political power. Protracted Roman occupation of Israel 2,000 years ago gave rise to renewed messianic expectation. One community of belief, now called Christianity, crystallized around Jesus. Convinced that he had all the necessary qualifications. Even so, the New Testament gives evidence of mixed opinions as to how people would know with certainty that Jesus was the Messiah. For Jews, messianic expectation did not end with Jesus. A century later, many Jews acclaimed Bar Kokhba as Messiah and rallied in support of his revolt. But the Romans quelled the uprising in 135 when they laid siege to the famous Dead Sea stronghold called Masada. Several significant claimants to messiahship have appeared since then, especially under Muslim rule and in medieval Europe, including David Menachem Alroi, 12th c. Kurdistan, David Ruvani, DC 1538. Solomon Malko, 1500-32, Shabbatai Zivi, 1626-76, and his successor in the movement, Jacob Frank, 1726-91. Some subcommunities of extremely Orthodox Jews have even more recently looked upon local leaders as messiahs. For the majority of Jews today, messianic expectation remains a minor article of faith. At most, Reformed theology has spiritualized the concept, teaching that the advent of the Messiah is a purely personal event rather than one that will usher in a new age.